Good afternoon, book lovers. This is Robert Boyd coming at you with another book report, and this time I'm talking about the book I Shocked Myself by Beatrice Wood. Before I get started, I do want to say, if you're watching this on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up and consider joining my Patreon, and also consider subscribing. My Patreon link will be in the comments below, in the description below at least, and if you're watching it on my blog, The Great God Pan is Dead, please consider hitting that Patreon button off to the side. The book I Shocked Myself is by Beatrice Wood, and she was a ceramicist, and she's best known for her relationship with the early New York City dadaists. She was born in 1893 and died in 1998 at the age of 105. The book was published in 1985, and the publisher is Schiffer Publishing Limited, a Pennsylvania publisher. And this is not a very attractive book. The design is terrible. I'm going to show you a page from it to give you an idea of how badly designed it is. And I get the impression looking at it that it might have been photographed from a previous edition, which I think was published by Chronicle Books, because the reproduction of the photographs in particular is terrible. So when I show you photographs, some of them will be from the book itself, and they're not that high quality, but some I will have downloaded from the internet, and they will look a little bit sharper. So she was born in San Francisco and studied French language in France as a child, and when she was growing up was very interested in the arts and decided to move to France when she was 19 to live a bohemian life. She wanted to be an actress, and in 1913 she attended the Rite of Spring, the premiere of the Stravinsky ballet, and this ballet is famous for having a riot at its premiere, but in reality there's little evidence of that, and her description of it does not sound like there was a riot. Her description of it sounds like there were passionate viewers on both sides. There were boos and cheers, and I suspect that someone observing this conflated it in their mind to a riot. Then World War I starts in 1914, and she moves back to New York City and lives a artsy life there amongst the theater crowd, and somehow meets Henri-Pierre Roché, a French writer who's deeply involved with the visual arts in New York, especially amongst the French expatriate crowd that had moved to New York, in essence, to avoid World War I. Roché was a novelist, or he's best known as a novelist. I think he was other kinds of writing. He did other kinds of writing prior to his novels, but his two best known novels are Jules and Jim, and I'm not going to pronounce these in French just because I'm going to get them wrong if I do, and Two English Girls. And these two novels were written when he's old, like in his 70s, and they're both about ménage à trois, and both of them were turned into movies by Francois Truffaut. And Roché also wrote a novel that was not published in his life called Victor. It's based loosely on his relationship with Wood and Duchamp. And it was, like I said, it wasn't published until after he died, but Wood read it, and it was reprinted in full in the first catalog for Duchamp, when he had a large retrospective at the Pompidou Center. So she read it in French, and she said she couldn't really recognize herself in it, so it wasn't a completely accurate novel, and if it was meant to be a autofiction. And it wasn't ever meant to be published, so we can say. Roche was 14 years older than Wood, and she was very young when they started their affair, and he was her first lover. She lost her virginity to him, and she does write about it, although not in lurid detail. She heard that the composer Edgar Varese, who was in New York City at the time, was in the hospital with a broken leg, so she went to visit him. And while she visited him, Marcel Duchamp was there also visiting, and they introduced themselves to each other. And through Duchamp, she met Walter and Louise Arensberg and a bunch of other artists who were in New York, including Brancusi and Francis Picabia and people like that. She really fell for Duchamp, but Duchamp did not reciprocate, apparently because Duchamp didn't want to get in the way of Roche's affair. And Roche and Duchamp were friends. So let me read a little section about Duchamp and Wood, how she felt about him. Sometimes, after a long afternoon of painting, he would take me out to dinner. Often we went to a 6th Avenue dump, but the elevated trains overhead sounded like music from the spheres, for I was with him. We were in harmony, whether in conversation or in silence. Except for the physical act, we were lovers. Roche, who had known Marcel for years, thought it was wonderful that I had this opportunity to work with him and encouraged me to go to his studio as often as possible. He even teased me about being in love with Marcel. Instead of being jealous, he was delighted when I told him I dreamt of Marcel. For Roche loved Marcel too, as I think everyone who knew him did. Marcel was beautiful, abstract, yet a loving human being. I think Marcel Duchamp must have been a great person to have as a friend. I've never heard any sort of negative description, any unpleasantness having to do with him. I've never heard of him being short or angry with anyone in any of the accounts I've read. And then in 1917, Wood and Roche and Duchamp collaborate on a zine called The Blind Man, which was a zine about New York Dada. And I discussed this a bit in one of my earliest book reports. This book called 3 New York Dadas and The Blind Man. And it has a facsimile of The Blind Man in it, as well as an English translation of Victor and a section from I Shock Myself. And it's a great book. I highly recommend it. It was published by Atlas Press, which specializes in these books that have primary documents from the Dada era. But this was about the end of Wood's participation in New York Dada. Because the New York Dadaists moved back to France after the war. Wood herself drifted away from the visual arts. She stayed involved in theater for a while, but not for the rest of her life or anything. In 1923, she joined the Theosophical Society, which Theosophy was one of those syncretic quasi-religions that melds East and West, and I can't tell you what the details are, but it was a fad back in the 20s and 30s. And she meets Krishnamurti, who was a Indian theosophist. He was born in India and raised in a theosophical community there, with the intent of being a leader of the theosophical movement. But as his life went on, he grew away from it. But he was a very popular lecturer and teacher, and gave extremely popular lectures about his philosophy of life for the rest of his life. And he pops up in art history again because when he moves to the United States. He lives in Ojai, California, which is sort of the base of his operations. And while he's there, he gives lectures, and amongst the attendees of his lectures are very young Jackson Pollock and Philip Guston. They went when they were in high school at Manual Arts in Los Angeles. In 1933, I think in the early 30s, I can't remember exactly the date, Wood moves to Los Angeles, which the Ahrensbergs also did. So it was a general migration. And Wood was from California, so it wasn't that weird. But she studied ceramics at Hollywood High School Adult Education and continued her studies of ceramics throughout the 30s. And then in 48, she moves to Ojai, close to the Krishnamurti compound. She stays in contact with Duchamp and Roche as a correspondent and visiting them when they come through town. I don't think Roche ever came back through town, but Duchamp traveled to the United States pretty frequently. But she during the World War II, she sent Roche care packages because everything was in short supply if you were a French person in the war. And then she finally sees him one last time in 1950. So he's quite old by then. He's in his 70s, and she's in her late 50s by then, I think. She still finds him handsome, but she describes him as a, quote, sweet old dodo, unquote. Spends all his time on the phone with old friends, not really getting out much, which I can understand. And while in Paris, she visits a very old Brancusi in his studio, and they discuss art. As I said, Duchamp remains in contact with her, and when she has her first one-person show at the American Gallery in Los Angeles, called Ceramics by Beatrice Wood in 1955, Duchamp designs the catalog cover for her. And then Duchamp travels back to Los Angeles in 1963 for a huge retrospective at the Pasadena Art Museum that was curated by Walter Hopps. Hopps had become friends with the Ahrensbergs, who were living in Los Angeles at the time, and consequently become knowledgeable about Duchamp and all the early dadaists. And so has this gigantic retrospective. Duchamp comes, plays chess with a naked woman at the opening, and Beatrice Wood hosts a dinner for Duchamp and his entourage at her small house up in Ojai. I don't know if that's the last time they saw each other, but it might have been. So, really, Beatrice Wood was a ceramicist, and I'm showing some of her ceramics right now. And I think they look pretty good. I mean, they're sort of pots and dishes and that kind of thing. The sort of thing that you expect ceramicists to do. And she's sort of famous for her luster glazes. I don't really know what a luster glaze is. I guess it's this shiny glaze that you see in some of these photos. And I really like kind of her light-hearted, more sculptural ladder pieces, which I'm also showing. And the thing is, I just don't know that much about ceramics. I don't know what her reputation is in the world of ceramics. I don't know if people consider her an important ceramics artist. The only ceramics artists I really know are Ken Price, Robert Arnson, and Peter Volkos. And interestingly enough, all three of them are West Coast artists, so maybe ceramics was a West Coast thing. Anyway, that was I shocked myself. I think as a young woman, she lived a kind of shocking bohemian lifestyle, but settled into a quasi-respectable little old lady artist in her later years. So, good for Beatrice Wood. I liked it. Like I said, she's not the greatest prose stylist, but it's okay. It's interesting, and it's an important footnote to art history to know about her, Duchamp, Henri-Pierre Roché, and the blind man. Thanks very much.